welcome. My name is Joëlle Favreau, and I'm delighted to see so many people here tonight on such a cold night. I think that I saw tonight is a frostbite. Alert. So, I find that whenever I hear that, it makes me think of people who don't have a place to sleep. And so I'm really hoping tonight that everybody has a place to go to, and I'm assuming that shelters are going to be busy tonight. I'm mentioning that because as a member of Nourish, that's an issue that we care deeply about, the issue of health, community, equity, and belonging. How do we create communities that bring those issues at the heart of all the work that they do? That's really where we started to do our work. It's a work that we do in partnership with, so I work out of the YWCA, Peterborough Health Burton, and we are working in partnership with Peterborough Public Health, with Green Up, and then we also have many other partners. For instance, in Peterborough we work actively with the New Canadian Centre, with Nogojiwana Friendship Centre. In Curve Lake, we do a lot of work with the Community Health Center, with Lovesick Lake, Native Women's Association in Lakefield. And in all the work that we do, we are really thinking about those issues of health, equity, belonging, and community. And I think that those issues are going to be echoed in the presentation that you hear tonight. So thank you so much for coming. I am going to introduce my colleague and friend, Carolyn Doris, who is going to be the moderator for tonight's presentation. And so let me tell you a little bit about Carolyn. Carolyn is a registered dietitian, and she's worked in a variety of nutrition programs at Peterborough Public Health over the last 20 years. Recently, she became a manager of family and community health, working with staff in the areas of healthy growth and development, chronic disease prevention, substance use, and school health. Carolyn is currently chair of Ontario Dietitians in Public Health. Outside of work, Carolyn lives food literacy and food systems thinking with her family as a mom of 4 busy tweens, and on their beef, sweet corn, and garlic farm that has been in the Doris family for almost 100 years. Actually, we couldn't have a better moderator for this panel. So thank you so much, Carolyn, for doing that.
Thank you, Joëlle. I always feel very humbled by having the pleasure to work with our partners at Nourish and in our community. It's really a pleasure for me. So I just want to say welcome, and I think it's very fitting that we're here talking about food insecurity in women and redefining food insecurity on this eve of International Women's Day. And to start, I just want to respectfully acknowledge that we gather here tonight for fellowship and learning and shared vision on the Treaty 20 Mississauga territory, and in the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations, which include Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Beausoleil, and Georgina Island First Nations. Together here, I think tonight, we can respectfully acknowledge that the William Treaties First Nations are the stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters in perpetuity, and that they continue to maintain this responsibility to ensure health and integrity for all of our generations to come. Okay? So thank you for that. And I think to start, I just wanted to acknowledge that for me, Nourish and the Peterborough Food Action Network are really important community partners and have done so much work to bring people together on issues like we are tonight. It's very exciting to have all of you join with us, and hopefully we can have some great learnings. And if you would like more information about both of these organizations, you can visit nourishproject.ca or foodinpeterborough.ca. I have to say that in my work, a really challenging piece, and I'm so pleased that two of our presenters tonight in particular have really challenged my thought and growth and understanding about the research behind food insecurity. And for many years, we've been able to access Canadian Community Health Survey data about food insecurity. But really it was Dr. Tarasuk, who's with us tonight, that challenged our thinking and to not accept the status quo of what we were being told by Health Canada. And fortunately in Peterborough Public Health, we have an epidemiologist who's been able to help us look at the real issue of food insecurity in our community. And I think the tale of this slide is certainly shocking, that we actually have a higher rate of food insecurity in the city and county at 16% versus 12% in Ontario. And that our low-income households, we know federally that low-income households are more food insecure, but when we look in Peterborough, that's trending even higher. And particularly when we look at the rate of severe food insecurity locally, we're 3 times the provincial average. So clearly this is a real call to action for us locally, that we need to do something. So I'm so happy to have so many of you here tonight on that. As we move then to our next speaker tonight, Dr. Marianne Martin, casually at a meeting of the Peterborough Food Action Network when I presented this data, she said, could you look at that from a gender perspective, which we'd never really thought about doing before. And again, I think thankfully we have amazing research partners and community members to challenge us on these things. And when we looked at that, this is the story that we have locally, that in Ontario, 15.5% of households with children under 18 are food insecure, and that's double here in Peterborough City and County. And then when we look at lone female-led households, 1 in 5 in Ontario are food insecure, but locally here, we're talking 1 in 2. Every other single mom is stressed each day and not sure how to make ends meet and how to feed her family. So again, I think perfect on this eve of International Women's Day that we think about this story locally and what does it mean, and a real call to action for us to take action and look at next steps. Okay. So then I had to think about, what does this mean, and our Nourish partnership, and so I just did a little bit of clipping. And again, it's so amazing to see the work of Nourish, bringing people together around eating good food, growing good food, and advocating for good food. And these are just a snippet of some of the activities of the last 2.5 years of Nourish, from speaker series to community meals, to eating together, projects with other community partners to expand our support for people in our community, to look at things like the humans of basic income and basic income advocacy, knowing that income is such an important part, which I know of the answer, which we're going to be talking about tonight, but also about civic engagement and elections, and that we all have a voice and a role to play, especially when we have information and data. We need to translate that. So I just wanted to show that as a group of very, very busy staff people who are pulling together amazing projects and work. So if you want more information about Nourish, nourishproject.ca. And then in reflection, I had to pull this one because this is momentous for us this evening, and we were just trying to reminisce when this was, but we think it was 2015, that we actually kicked off our first Nourish speaker series with Valerie. So it's so great to have you back with us tonight. Okay, and to think that we are a few years later and we know more, but there's more to do. And then we also have had Marianne Martin speak about her PhD about Sometimes I Feel Like I'm Counting Crackers. So again, great to see friends in the work that we're doing. And then we also had to do a little bit of Google work and found some information about Melanie Goodchild, who's with us this evening as well. And we're very pleased to have you with us and to be at your first Nourish event, but clearly it won't be the last if you're tracking like everyone else. Okay. Great. So I think what we'll do is, I think Alicia's going to pull up the Dr. Tarasuk's PowerPoint presentation, and I will do a quick piece. But again, I just wanted to say that food insecurity is such an important issue, and I'm so glad to have so many of you with us tonight to talk about it. So to start off, Dr. Valerie Tarasuk is a professor in the Department of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Toronto, and the principal investigator on the research program Proof. And I have to tell you, she's kind of, for me, it's like having a rock star in the crowd, so this is very exciting. Val's research extends to Canadian food policy and population-level dietary assessment, but her primary focus is food insecurity. She's worked with the great scope and nature of this problem across Canada to examine policy and problematic program responses. And her recent work includes studies on food charity, community programs, and analysis of population survey data on health, nutrition, and demographics and how it correlates to household food insecurity in Canada. So welcome back to Valerie, and we look forward to hearing your messages tonight.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a soft spot for Peterborough, I have to say, for the radical work that has come out of Peterborough over all those million years that I've known about folks here, so it's nice to be here. So I'm going to move fast because I've got a lot to say. So just to start, I wanted to put this up. This is my very coarse summary of the questions that are used to monitor food insecurity in Canada. I offer them to you because the work that I'm going to talk about is all drawing on data from large population health surveys that have used these questions. The questions never cease to appall me, really, to think that we are asking these questions day in and day out on national surveys because people say yes to them. The mildest question is, do you ever worry about running out of food because of a lack of money? And then through to compromises in dietary intake and absolute levels of deprivation, so going hungry without eating, going whole days without eating. And the questions differentiate between the experiences of adults and children because there's a huge body of research that sadly will only continue to grow that shows when families are struggling with scarce resources, adults and particularly women will deprive themselves of food to free up what they have for their children. So that's the basis. That's the instrument, the measurement instrument that is used for the rest of this talk. Here you see 4 years of nationally representative data that we have with those questions. And a couple of things to flag here. This is a household level measure, so what you're seeing are the millions of Canadian households who are identified as food insecure through this measurement. The bars are shaded to show levels of severity based on the number of those questions that people said yes to. And what you can see just off the top is that the lines are going up. Over that period, by our best estimate, there was an increase of about 600,000. So we're looking at, I think it's 1.7 million households, over 4 million people captured in those instruments. The next year for which we will have nationally representative data is actually 2017. But it is only recently that we have gained access to 2017 data. Soon we'll get 2018, and so hopefully in a few more months we'll be looking at 2017 and 18 numbers here. I don't know what direction they will be going. I typically talk about this problem as a household level problem, but the invitation from Joelle and her focus on gender tonight made me think that I needed to talk about individuals for at least a little bit of the time. So this is data from Statistics Canada for 2007-8 and 11-12, same years as the other graph I just showed you. And now we're looking at individuals across the life cycle, so starting from the age of 12 and upwards. And what you can see again is the pattern, whereby the numbers have gotten higher in the more recent survey. You can also see the density of food insecurity amongst young people. Here's what it looks like when we take those numbers and break them open by gender. This is 2011-12 data, and what you can see is that women are disproportionately represented in this problem. And that is particularly true amongst those who are young adults and middle age. I think the overrepresentation of women amongst the ranks of the food insecure in Canada relates, well, to a couple of things, and one of them is their roles as mothers. This is the breakdown nationally. You saw some data from Peterborough. This is the breakdown nationally in terms of household types. And it is a sickening reality in Canada, but the mere act of having a child in the household, so someone under the age of 18 in a household, is enough to elevate the probability of food insecurity. And that has been true since we began to measure this problem. Just simply having children increases the likelihood of food insecurity. Like, how wrong is that? And those who are most vulnerable are lone parent women. And you can see that they're much, much more vulnerable than couples with children. But still, a couple with children is much worse off than a couple without children. So there's very much a story of gender here, but it's intertwined with the caring responsibilities of women. The other aspect that I think associates with the high levels of food insecurity and the disproportionate presence of women and girls in those numbers is what drives this problem. From everything that we have done on this topic, what we have come to understand is that there are two drivers. What will determine whether a household is food insecure is its income and assets. It takes both. Income, both the amount of money that's flowing through the month from whatever source it comes from, but also the stability of that income. And the assets are the thing that you can draw on if you have a problem with the income. So it's the combination of low income, precarious income, and no asset that causes someone to plummet into these situations that are captured on those 18 questions. Here's the relationship with income, and it makes sense, right? As income decreases, the probability of somebody saying that they're struggling to put food on the table because of a lack of income rises, and that makes sense. And the bars here are differentiating the experience based on the level of severity. But it's not just income. It's also where that income's coming from. When we look at income source, we can see another pattern that is very, very sharp, whereby people whose main source of income is seniors' income, so pensions or retirement incomes, have a very low probability of food insecurity. And at the other end of that spectrum are people whose main source of income is social assistance. And roughly 2/3 of those people are reporting food insecurity, and about half of them are reporting severe food insecurity. But even when we do more complicated analysis where we're taking into account household income, education levels, the household composition, home ownership, everything else we can think of, still being on social assistance is a risk factor for food insecurity, independent of how much money somebody's getting. And being on a senior's income is a protective factor. And we think that that is in part about the fact that those two income sources are mapping something else. And that is a history of poverty in the case of one, and a history perhaps of greater stability in the case of many in the other camp. It's also mapping things related to the stability, the security of the income. Another way to think about the importance of income source is this picture. Same data that I just showed you, but now configured in a different way to say, if we take all the households in Canada that are food insecure and put them in a pie, and then divide it up based on main source of income, what do we see? Well, social assistance recipients have the highest probability of being food insecure, but in fact, the majority of the people that are food insecure in the country are in the workforce. How come? Well, we can't know a ton about work from the data that we have available to us, but what we can see is that they're more likely to be precarious workers. They're low-wage, part-time, short-term employment, so unstable, insecure incomes, but also a situation where many people are trying to be fed and survive off the income of one or two people, and maybe those are one or two people with part-time work or contingent work. So the precarity of the income is kind of an independent part of the story of who's got the problem. Just briefly to comment on assets, the biggest asset anyone ever has in their lifetime is their home. And if you own your own home, you are way better off than somebody who doesn't. And part of that is about who gets to own a home and who doesn't. But another part of it is that, you know, if you happen to be in one of those precarious jobs or you lose your job, if you own your home, you can borrow against it, right? And you can sell it. So it buffers what we call income shocks. So bad things happen to you, you've got a home, you've got a line of credit on it. You don't, you have nothing. It's, you know, you're done. And that's the story of the renter. Okay, why does it matter that we have this combination of income and assets putting so many Canadians into food insecurity? Well, food insecurity is a very, very potent social determinant of health. And it almost doesn't matter what health condition we look at, people who are food insecure are more likely to have it. And all I'm doing in that slide is a laundry list of Canadian studies. I haven't even drawn on anything from the United States here. We know that children in food insecure situations will have poor development, poor growth. In time, they will be more likely to manifest with problems like asthma and depression. Adults in food insecure situations are much, much more likely to have been diagnosed with a whole host of chronic diseases, but also mental health problems as well as physical problems. It's also clear that adults in food insecure situations who have chronic conditions are less able to manage them. Of course they would be. And now we're charting mortality rates. Just a couple of things that to amplify that theme a little bit. The disadvantage that Canadians experience in the context of food insecurity is visible almost from birth. What you're looking at in this slide is exclusive breastfeeding, rates of exclusive breastfeeding by the food insecurity status of the mother. And what we can see is when, everybody knows the recommendation is exclusive breastfeeding to 6 months. When babies are first born, most of them begin by being breastfed in Canada. And the rate of breastfeeding, so it's close to 90%, 85, 95%. The rate of initiation of exclusive breastfeeding doesn't differ by food insecurity status at all. But within a couple of months, the lines start to separate. Within 2 months, we can see a significant drop-off of the food insecure women, and that just keeps falling apart. And I offer it to you just as a little example of the way in which the disadvantages that come with being food insecure just cascade out. Here's another story. This is us looking at rates of chronic disease amongst adults, working-aged adults who are food insecure. And this is a laundry list of chronic conditions that are asked about on the Canadian Community Health Survey. The bars are divided between men and women, and they're graded to show levels of severity. Again, you can see a graded effect whereby the more severe the household food insecurity is that's reported, the greater the probability that an adult responding in that household will report having been diagnosed with a chronic condition. Actually, there's a greater probability that they'll have 2 or 3 chronic conditions. And it can be anything. I mean, we think about often diabetes or heart disease as problems that associate with poor diets and with, poor access to food. But what you can see here is it's a huge spectrum. Arthritis, asthma, you name it, it's all here. Okay, but there's one that I just want to pause on, and that's, I should have gone back. It's the second set of bars here, and now I've just reproduced them, but not matched the colors exactly. This is a diagnosis of a mood or anxiety disorder. And I want you to take a look at that bar at the very, very top. So in Canada, women who are in severely food insecure households, almost half of them will report having been diagnosed with a mood or anxiety disorder. 1 in 2 women in Canada who are in a severely food insecure household have been diagnosed with a mood or anxiety disorder. And it's the strongest relationship we ever see in terms of the relationship between food insecurity and health at a population level is mental illness, and the intersection for women in particular is profound. It's a complicated story, but any of you who work on the front lines with women who are very low income and struggling, I'm sure this isn't a surprise to you at all. You've known this all along. It's a complicated story because there's a bit of a chicken and an egg here, that women who are healthy but find themselves falling upon hard times and ending up struggling to make ends meet, some portion of them will develop depression that they didn't have to start with. But the flip is also true, that women who are struggling with mental illness are more likely to become food insecure. So it's a circular problem. But there's one thing we can say with certainty, that the combination is toxic, right? It's a vicious cycle, because neither one of those things is going to get better when they're having to be coped with simultaneously. And that, I think, explains this next picture. Now, I know this is a complicated one as well. What can I tell you? I'm an academic. This is what happens when you let me out. This is us charting healthcare utilization in Ontario for mental health reasons. And so we take Ontario respondents to this Canadian Community Health Survey and identify their food insecurity status, and then match it with their OHIP number. and then say, so what have they been doing lately? From an OHIP perspective. And so what you can see is at the bottom, the prevalence of food insecurity amongst this group of working-aged adults, and it's roughly 12%. So that's the dark red stuff at the end. But you see how that dark red stuff starts to creep in more and more to the bars. It's close to 40% of people in Ontario who are hospitalized for a mental health reason are food insecure. And to be coming from a severely food insecure situation is a much, much higher likelihood of being hospitalized for mental health reasons. So I offer it to you just as an illustration of how things get out of control, how hard it is to manage mental health in the context of food insecurity. This is another way to talk about how hard it is to manage health in the context of food insecurity. This is a graph that some of you I know will have seen before. This is us again linking data about household food insecurity status to health administrative data in Ontario and saying what is the cost of this problem to the province. The more severe the food insecurity, the greater the number of dollars on average that someone will burn up in healthcare usage over the 12-month period for which we're measuring food insecurity. And you can see the difference between the severely food insecure and this food secure is almost triple. And the bars are colored to break down different types of healthcare utilization, but basically any type of healthcare utilization we look at, except the very, very bottom assistive device stuff, has a strong differential whereby people who are food insecure and more severely so are more likely to have accessed that service. What do we do about this? Well, it's often when we talk about food insecurity and the response, I mean the response is, well, we've got to do something about food. So what I'm showing you here is kind of an unusual piece of information that we just were able to get our hands on, that is household expenditure data. So this is another study by Statistics Canada, the survey of household spending, where households were surveyed and asked to keep track of their expenditures over a period, and then that was annualized. And so here what you're looking at is the amount of money people spend on food. And it's been adjusted so that it's taking into account the number of people in the household. And now we're lining it up by food insecurity status. And so the marginal, moderate, and severely food insecure, the red bars are going under the black line because that's showing us a deficit. And so it's what you'd expect. The more severely food insecure people are spending less money on food. And at the very bottom here, we're talking about differences of maybe $2,500 or $3,000 a year on average that people are spending less if they're food insecure. So I think, okay, people have got, we identify them because they're struggling to put food on the table. Well, big deal. They're spending less on food. Of course they are. And, it's moving in a graded fashion by how severe the situation is. Okay, but look at this. They're also spending less on clothing. They're spending less on housing. They're spending less on other necessities, things like healthcare, education expenses, things like that. They're actually spending less on everything. So we start out with a story that is they're spending less on food, but by the time we get to the end of the spectrum of expenditures that were captured in this survey, which are supposed to be a comprehensive survey of household expenditures, now our differences aren't 2,500 or 3,000. Now we're actually talking more like 30,000, right? We've got big differences. So I offer it to you just to kind of provoke your thinking about what do we do to intervene on this? Because we've got a dog's breakfast here. If we only talked about the first bars, we'd be saying, oh, gee whiz, anything we can do to put more food in those houses has got to be a good idea. But eventually you realize that the material compromises that come with being food insecure are ubiquitous. It's across everything. People are compromising their spending on all sorts of necessities, not just food. We find them through the lens of food, and I think there are good reasons for that. I think food is a very, very good way to find people that are struggling because it's one of the last things that you'll give up. But at the end of the day, we've got a broad spectrum. Okay, what are we going to do? Well, there is really only one angle that we have any evidence moves the needle on food insecurity. And what I've got here is the big list of 5. Anytime since we started collecting this data, anytime we've had the opportunity to actually look at income-based interventions, policies that have improved people's incomes, anytime we can see it well enough to analyze it, we can see an effect. So it started with us looking at the poverty reduction strategy in Newfoundland and Labrador. There was a study that came not from our group, but from McGill University looking at the universal child care benefit when that was introduced under Harper back in 2006. Then there have been other studies looking at changes in social assistance in British Columbia. A very famous work by Lynn McIntyre in her memory looking at the effect of a guaranteed annual income basically through the lens of seniors' benefits. And most recently we've done a little piece of work looking at the effect of the Ontario Child Benefit. Anytime that we can actually identify a policy that has increased incomes for low-income people, we can see a reduction in food insecurity. Okay, I'm just very fast, very quickly. I don't know where my timekeeper is. I hope she's left the room. But just very quickly, a couple of words about the Ontario Child Benefit. It was the signature act of the Ontario Poverty Reduction Strategy that got rolled out in 2006, 2007, 2008. And it was a benefit for families with children. It was designed, it was intended to be the mechanism through which the Ontario government would reduce child poverty. And so when the poverty reduction strategy was introduced, it was a big deal to talk about how, we're going to reduce child poverty in Ontario by 25% in 5 years, 25 and 5. That was the demand of activists, and it was seen as a huge victory when we started seeing politicians from the Ontario Liberal government at the time talking about this as the thing that was going to make that happen. But it was a benefit for working families, so it made no real difference in the incomes of people on social assistance. The children that were going to be moved out of poverty were children of people that were in the workforce, not children from social assistance recipients. And at the top you can see the amount of money that was moved under the child benefit. So at its peak, we're talking about a little more than $100 a month per head for children. The $20,000 is the point at which that benefit starts to be phased out. So if you have more than $20,000 in income, it starts to be phased out after that. So how did it work? Well, here you see us doing our best to identify households that were eligible or ineligible for the Ontario Child Benefit and what happened to food insecurity rates over that time. So the blue bars are households or families that were eligible for the Ontario Child Benefit. And because it was a benefit that was targeted to the low end of the income spectrum with that 20,000 threshold, the rates of food insecurity among the group are higher. I mean, the red bars include people like me, right? So it's a much broader spectrum of the Ontario population. So of course, as a group, we'd have a lower rate of food insecurity. So it makes sense that the blue bars would be higher because this in some ways was targeting lower income people. You can see the bar goes down, and then what happens? It starts to go up. So we actually do, if you care, you could, if you're having trouble sleeping later tonight, I'd like to recommend this reading at the corner. We do a bunch of statistical work to try to take into account a bunch of things and say, is what happened here, and is it significant once we consider other factors? And yes, there is a significant reduction in food insecurity in 2009-10 and 11-12, but it stops being significant in 13-14. Our lights are turned out in after 13-14 because in 2015-16 Ontario chose not to measure food insecurity. And here you see what the provincial prevalence looks like over this period. For all intents and purposes, the provincial prevalence did not change. You can see the top bars going up and down, but if we run a statistic against those bars, it's a flat line. So while we can see a decrease in food insecurity amongst families that were eligible for the Ontario Child Benefit, most of those who were food insecure remained food insecure, and there was no change in the provincial prevalence. Well, why not? A couple of things. Most food insecure households in Ontario weren't eligible for the Ontario Child Benefit. It only captured a slim slice, that was roughly 20% by our estimate, of households in Ontario that were food insecure to start with when that benefit was introduced, received the benefit. Why? Because the others some of them were on social assistance, some of them had incomes that were too high to qualify because of the phase-out threshold, and a whole bunch of people didn't have children. So it never could have done very much in terms of food insecurity rates in the province because it was taking such a small slice. And important still as a policy goal to reduce food insecurity amongst the children in those families, but it was a small speck in terms of the bigger problem. The other thing that's true about it is that the amount of money wasn't very much, and it wasn't indexed to inflation. There's some kind of indexation that was talked about. I don't know where it's at now with the new government, but during the period that we're looking at, there was no indexation. This is a period of profound food price inflation, among other things. And so whatever the real dollar value was of the benefit, it would have diminished, which I think is probably partly why we see it whittling away to the point where we can't even see an effect by 2013-14. So what's the moral of the story here? Well, you know, doing something about the incomes of very low-income people can reduce food insecurity, even if you're not actually trying to do that. It happens sometimes, as it did in this case. But to do a better job would be to do it a bit more deliberately. So I'll end where I began this with, I think we've got a problem that needs to be tackled, and I think it means getting more serious about tackling that first bar, because that is that first ball, I guess I should say, because that's the place where we can I think have the most impact if we want to do something to reduce this.
Next up, we have Dr. Marianne Martin. I'm still getting used to calling her Dr. Martin, so she's not used to it either, she says. Marianne is we're very fortunate to have her expertise in our community. She's a feminist food systems researcher and an advocate. She right now is completing a postdoctoral fellowship at Carleton University with Nourishing Communities Sustainable Local Food Systems Research Group. This work is focusing on the impacts of small community-based food organizations that prioritize social and environmental goals. In June, she earned her PhD from Trent University, where she focused on the household food practices of Peterborough mothers living on low incomes and the ways that local community-based programs and food initiatives can help to support them. And her work has greatly informed by ongoing participation with food systems collaboratives such as the Peterborough Food Action Network, the Nourish Project, and DIG, Durham Integrated Growers, as well as the Durham Food Policy Council. At the end of the day, though, Marianne does say that she is still trying to figure out how to get her own teens to also eat veggies. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Marianne shared her PhD research with us just a few months ago with the Sometimes I Feel Like Counting Crackers. So thanks, Marianne, for joining us, and I'll hand this over to you.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here tonight and to see all your faces in front of me, and a special pleasure to be on the same panel with Valerie Tarasuk and with Melanie. Thank you so much. So tonight I'm going to talk about defining food insecurity. When I went to create this presentation, I went back to the name of the panel, which is Women Redefining Food Insecurity. And I had to stop and think, how would I define it? I think there's a few different ways that I would define it. But in the end, I decided that I was going to define it as the need to prove deservingness. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? No? There. So I'm going to start with a short story about one of the participants in my research. And this is an image that she drew as we were talking in an interview. Her name is Nora, and Nora is a single mom living in Peterborough. She's got 4 kids. When we spoke, the oldest was a teenager and the youngest was a toddler. She's got no family around, no friends, and very few acquaintances. Nobody to watch the kids. And Nora came into the coffee shop. I spent a lot of time in coffee shops while I was doing my research. And she came in, and she was visibly nervous. She really looked nervous. She sat down, she wouldn't look at me. She was jittery, she was uncomfortable, and when we spoke, she was very self-deprecating. And I turned on the recorder, which probably didn't help things, with her permission, and we spoke about what food looks like in her home and how it's done. And as we went along, Nora settled and became visibly less nervous. And we got to the end of the interview, and I went to turn off my recorder. And she says, wait a second. I'm not done yet. There's more that I want to tell you, and there's more that other people need to know. So this interaction, to me, she could have been nervous for all kinds of reasons, but the way that I'm reading it is that she was a little worried about what I might think of her. She was a little bit worried about how I might judge her when she told me her story of doing food. And that's the topic that I want to talk with you about tonight, is this idea of judgment and this idea of worthiness and deservedness. So now I'll tell you a little bit about the study. In last year, in 2018, I completed a study where I was looking at how mothers who live on low incomes feed their families, and how food programs in this community help to support them. And a little bit later into the study, I developed a third research question, which was, how are these programs helping to affect the structural issues that affect food insecurity? So I have two research groups. The first were Peterborough mothers living on low incomes. There were 21 women who I spoke with, and all of them live in Peterborough City or Peterborough County. All of them were raising at least one child under the age of 16, and all of them self-identified as living on low incomes. And I met with these women, and we sat and we talked about the most ordinary of things. I wanted to know what it looks like in their homes when it comes to food. We talked about doing dishes, we talked about making lunches, making grocery lists, going to the grocery store, taking things out of the freezer for dinner, all the very ordinary things that go into food work. And during these interviews, I asked them to draw on a piece of paper, what does a week of food look like in your home? And so they did, most of them. And those images opened up our conversations and allowed us to allowed me to understand even more fully what happens in their homes. My other research group were Peterborough Community Food Initiatives. I met with 6 people working in community food programs, about 7 programs, and I'll try and list them off. I need my fingers for this. Community Gardens, the Cleaning Project, Come Cook With Us, Collective Kitchens, A Taste of Nourish, Nourish Havelock, and there's one more. And Just Food, thank you. Thank you, and Just Food Box program. And these interviews involved looking at how these programs are engaging with mothers who live on low incomes and how they're strategizing to support them even better. When both these sets of interviews were done, I invited the women to go on a tour of one of the community food initiatives to find out more about it, to be able to ask questions, and then to come back and talk with me about how that program might fit or might not fit so well for their families. So tonight, as I go through, I'm going to be talking about deservingness. And I'm going to focus primarily on the Peterborough mums and talk with you a little bit about the food initiatives a little closer to the end. So a main focus of the research is household food work. And I see household food work as instrumental, I've cut off the G there, as instrumental in transforming food access into meals. It involves all that work around food, around planning, acquiring, producing, preparing, serving, feeding, cleaning up, storage, waste management, all of that sort of stuff. I apologize for my slide, it looked better at home. So a lot of it is really practical work. A lot of it is very hands-on, going to the grocery store, doing dishes, making pasta, those sorts of things. But a lot of it is cognitive. A lot of it is thinking, right? Thinking about who's going to be home for dinner this week, thinking about budgeting, thinking about what's going to be on sale next week, thinking. There's a lot of managerial work involved as well. I find that typically in households, there's one person who carries around that mental filing cabinet. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? The one who knows if we're down to the last egg, and the one who knows if we're down to the last drop of milk, and the one who knows where we keep grandma's recipe for chocolate chip cookies. You know that person? So a lot of times that happens in food, in households. And sometimes that work is delegated out, and sometimes not, but often there's that one person who carries it around. And then there's emotional work as well. Food is intimately tied with culture, with tradition, with love, with relationship, with all kinds of things that involve interaction between people. And so there's work that goes into trying to ensure that people feel included and nourished, loved, celebrated through food. There's a lot of satisfaction in being able to do that. And there's a lot of distress in not being able to do that. So this is how I see food work. So I'll tell you a little bit from the participants' point of view. So here's a quote, and some of you are familiar with it, from one of my participants who I've named Una. And she was talking about feeding her kids, particularly her teenage son. And she said, "He's a growing boy. You always hear about it. So sometimes I feel like I'm counting crackers. I tell my older son, we don't get money until like 5 days from now. So we got to make sure we have enough of this for the whole week." And some of you know that I'm absolutely captivated with this idea of counting crackers. I think it just really fits what many of the women were talking about, that extra layer of work that happens in households when there's not enough income. That extra layer of calculating and counting and predicting and planning that goes on to try and ensure that there's enough money for food, or that there's enough food to get to the end of the week or the end of the month. And what I found as I spoke with all the women is that all of this work is completely amplified when there's not enough income. All of this work, the practical work of getting to the grocery store when you don't have a car and when you can't afford a bus pass. The cognitive work of thinking, trying to figure out how you're going to make something out of the food that you got from the food bank. The emotional work of trying to figure out how you're going to help your kids feel included at lunchtime when their lunches aren't going to look like the other kids' lunches, or you don't have money for pizza day. Oops. Oh, there. Okay. So I have to say, and Valerie's already spoken to this, that food insecurity is very gendered, and food work is very gendered. The division of food labor continues today. It's not a new problem. It's certainly an old problem, and things have changed somewhat over the years. People are cooking less in their homes, so there's less food work to do. Men are doing more in their homes when it comes to food, but at the end of the day, women are still doing the vast majority of food work. And what I'd like to really clarify is that the gender division of food labor is much more than a matter of fairness. It's much more than, squabbles over who's going to do the dishes and deciding who's got to go out into the cold to get milk from the corner store. It runs much deeper than that. So here's what Simone decided to put on her page. I asked her, what do you think of when you think of a week of food in your home? And she wrote, I think of having enough healthy snacks, meat, dairy, and salad stuff, so everybody has enough to eat. I don't want the kids to be hungry. And for Simone in her household, the kids going hungry was a reality. That was something she really faced. And she mitigated it by skipping meals, by not eating enough. She managed to get around it so the kids always had something to eat, but she didn't. And she wasn't the only one who told me stories like this. Here's a quote from Alicia. And she was talking about wanting to go to a local food program. She really wanted to participate. She says, and I tried to call, but nobody ever called me back. So rather than keep persistent about it, because that felt really needy and wrong, I just didn't call back. because if they didn't call me back, they're probably full. And I don't want to be a nuisance, and I certainly don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth by being demanding, right? So you can see and you can hear the mental turmoil she was going through with regards to making a phone call. She had called once, didn't hear back, and what it took to try and call again was just overwhelming. She couldn't do it, right? She was worried about how she would be seen as needy, wrong, persistent, demanding, ungrateful. All of this stuff was going through her head over making a phone call. I had a lot more stories. I ran these past my partner last night and he said, take them out, they're too many. So I did. But there are all kinds of ways that women are trying to cope with food insecurity. They're experiencing inadequate food intake, like Simone. They're experiencing all kinds of emotions. They told me about guilt and shame, anxiety and fear, loneliness and isolation, all kinds of stuff when it came to food. They experience a sense of surveillance, of being watched, of being judged, of people noticing things about them. You know, going to the food bank, pulling out your iPhone and wondering, are people going to judge me because I've got an iPhone but I can't afford to feed my family? Are people going to notice that I'm standing in line for the food bank? All these sorts of questions came to mind. Asking for help was really difficult. Women were always telling me how difficult it was to go to anybody to ask for help, to feel like they were relying on others. And breaching social acceptability. I heard about shoplifting, I heard about women working in adult entertainment, I heard about women bending the rules and bending the truth so that they could ensure that there was food on the table or that they had money to put food on the table. So what I would argue is that a lot of this comes down to a myth, and that is a myth of deservingness. We have a really strong, persistent, stubborn discourse about work in our society. And we've got this idea that if you work for pay, then you're actually working. That's real work. And it's productive. You hear our politicians talk about becoming productive members of society when they mean you need to be working for pay. It means, or it seemed to mean, being self-sufficient, paying taxes, giving to your community, and having some sort of knowledge or skills. And then there's the flip side. If you don't work for pay, then you're not really seen as working. You're seen more as being unproductive, as being lazy, dependent, using other people's taxes, taking from your community, and not really having knowledge and skills. And all this is completely amplified if you live on a low income. So this myth of deservingness is something that was very visible among the women that I spoke with. As we spoke, it was apparent to me that they were trying to let me know that they were good at being mothers. All of them told me about how they feed their kids healthy food. I didn't ask about that. I didn't ask about what kind of food, what sort of nutrition they had in their homes, but they all told me, I'm feeding my kids healthy food. Most of them talked about vegetables when they did. They were trying, or it seemed to me that they were trying to prove themselves as consumers. We live in a consumer age. We live where the market economy is king. And the women that I spoke with wanted me to know that they could spend their money wisely. So they talked a lot about how thrifty they were. They talked a lot about how they spent their money, they cut their coupons, they went to different stores. And I don't doubt any of what they were saying, but there was this sense that they really needed to tell me this. They also talked about worthiness when it came to being food program participants, particularly when it came to food banks. They didn't want to rock the boat. They didn't want to ask for too much. They didn't want to seem ungrateful. They didn't want to take from somebody who might need it more. And I heard these repeated over and over again. So through their stories, women told me a lot about the problem of food insecurity. But they also gave me some clues and some ideas about addressing food insecurity. So this is a quote from Hannah. She says, well, yeah, my girlfriend, she lives up the street. But sometimes, if she has a worse day than I have, or a worse week than I'm having, or whatever, and sometimes it's just easier to get together and then we share everything. Share the buying of the food, share the cooking, share the cleaning up, and the kids are fed and we all have leftovers. We're happy. And this quote really symbolizes something that I noticed among the stories of the women, this idea that when they were working collectively, collaboratively, with reciprocity, that there was a sense of peace, there was a sense of joy. They talked about happiness in a way where they didn't have to sort of bracket what they were telling me with discussions of worthiness. So if we come back to this myth of deservingness, I think Hannah's words really say a lot about how we might be able to approach it, how we might be able to dismantle it. And this is something that I see happening a lot in this community. Among community food initiatives, they understand this idea of reciprocity, collectivity, collaboration, of working together, and using food as a way to do so, using food as a way to bring people to the table, using food to bring people to gardens, to farmers' fields, to the Just Food Box program, to cooking classes, to all of these kind of programs. And there's a focus on access, on making these programs accessible to people, but also making them so they're dignified, so that you don't have to share how much you may be in need. You don't have to share a lot of details about your life. There's a sense of inclusion, people coming together, like tonight and all those events that Carolyn showed, a sense of bringing people together across many lines of difference. There's also a sense of universality, that that programs are open to everybody. And that was really something that was important to women. They didn't want to be seen as going to a program that they knew was just for low-income people. They wanted to go to programs that were for everyone. And in this community, there's a sense of comprehensiveness. There are programs working together through the Peterborough Food Action Network and under the umbrella of Nourish. Programs working together, understanding what each other are doing, being able to let program participants know what each other are doing, strategizing about how to make this all work for this community. And when people come to these programs, it's not as takers, and it's not just as students, it's as people who bring something to the table, as teachers and learners, as givers and takers. They come together in reciprocity. So if we go back to trying to address food insecurity, a big and persistent problem. Addressing food insecurity definitely requires addressing income security. There's no question about it. And addressing income insecurity requires addressing policy. I would argue, though, that addressing policy requires addressing the myth of deservingness. And that until we start talking differently about what it is to live in poverty or live in food insecurity, and until we start looking at it differently about who belongs and who doesn't, who deserves benefits and who doesn't, that it's going to be difficult to address it. So I was advised that I needed to put a summary slide. So this is my summary slide. So my takeaways. First, household food work is complex and amplified by low income. Second, the gendered division of labor goes far beyond fairness to have serious physical, emotional, and social effects. A major root of ongoing engendered food insecurity is the myth of deservingness. Addressing food insecurity requires addressing this myth in communities and in policy. And community food initiatives here are doing this through access, universality, and promoting dignity. So hopefully this will help with redefining food insecurity.
I'm very pleased now to welcome Melanie Goodchild to join with us here this evening. Melanie is Anishinaabe Moose Clan from Big Tagon Nishnabeg First Nations. She is also studying systems thinking and social innovation at the University of Waterloo, where she's a PhD candidate in social and ecological sustainability and a research fellow with the Waterloo Institute for Social Innovation and Resilience. Melanie is a senior advisor to many social change initiatives that tackle our wicked problems that we're facing today, including the Food Systems Lab and another Nourish, the Future of Food and Healthcare, that looks at complexities and prototypes approaches to solution finding. And we know she's also very personally active in work around decolonizing our own food systems here. So welcome, Melanie. We look forward to hearing from you. And I'm not sure, when I pulled up one of the slides, I thought it was interesting that Nassau has actually been looking at some of Melanie's work. So it's exciting to have you with us tonight.
Excuse me while I get organized. I always travel with lots of stuff. Okay, bonjour, ndero maganaduk. Miguch, apichigo miguch, bizindawiyag, wapshkeo gijadakwez and indigenous cause, wapnang indigenous cause, musto dem, bigtgang nishnabig donjaba, kitagon zibi donjaba. So I introduced myself with my spirit names, and I want to start by acknowledging that I'm a visitor to this territory. I am Anishinaabe, and I'm from northwestern Ontario. My grandparents are actually from 4 different First Nations and 4 different treaty areas. So I'm a member of Bigtagong Nishnabeg, and my mother's from Kitagonzibi, which is Garden River near Sault Ste. Marie. One of my grandmothers is from Couchiching in Treaty 3 in Lake of the Woods, and my other grandmother's from Aralan in Treaty 9 First Nations. So, and they're all Anishinaabe communities. And part of the work that I do brings me to food and thinking about food insecurity in a particular environment, which is in healthcare settings and in long-term care facilities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I thought what I would do is share with you what we call Debajimawin, which is my own story of coming to food. So it's a little bit different than what we've heard so far today. So a couple of months ago, my auntie Thelma had quadruple bypass surgery and found herself at the Peter Monk Cardiac Unit in downtown Toronto. So she was flown down from Bigtagong Nishnabeg, and I was there the first day that she was out of surgery. So she was, you know, pretty loopy and really just kind of dealing with recovery, immediate recovery from the surgery. And then I went back several days later where she was more mobile and awake, and the food was coming in, you know, the hospital food on the tray. And I remember her nurse who was taking her vitals at the time said, "Oh, are you going to have dinner?" And my auntie made a face, "Oh, no." And the nurse said, "Yeah, just more nasty muck, huh?" And you know, that idea of food in healthcare settings being not good, and we've all experienced that, you know, where you're smuggling in yummy food to a patient who may or may not actually need that food, but wants that food. And so this has brought me to some of the work that I do, and I kind of drifted into social innovation as a bit of an outcast from other disciplines. I studied sociology in my undergraduate and master's degree. And I worked for a tribal council in the Anishinaabe Nation, which represents 49 First Nation communities, 32 are remote fly-in. For 5 years, I worked on the Suicide Prevention Initiative, and then for 2 years, I was the Director of Health Policy and Planning. 32 of those communities have very difficult access to food and deal with food insecurity issues. They have land-based sustenance, which is challenged, of course, by climate change. But they also have to deal with the food prices in northern communities, which is, quite a bit you'll see on the news about that. And so I kind of stumbled into social innovation in 2015, 2016, and I'm just going to share this briefly. Oh, sorry, I was going to start my own timer so that nobody has to. So I kind of stumbled into social innovation, and so 2015-16 was a bit of a pivotal year for me in my own leadership development. At the time I was working for the Canadian Red Cross. I was the National Director of Indigenous Relations doing disaster management, so responding to large-scale disasters. And someone said to me, hey, there's a program at the Banff Centre called Getting to Maybe. It's about social innovation, large-scale transformative social change. That sounds like you, Melanie. You're always talking about changing the world, and you're always talking about really big, big ideas. And so I applied to the program, having never heard of it. I Googled it. I found out who some of the big thinkers were. I started learning about Francis Wesley, Dr. Francis Wesley, they call her Donella Meadows, the late Donella Meadows, Thinking in Systems, C.S. Hollings, Resilience Thinking, scholars like Peter Senge, who talks about the learning organization. And I started to learn about where social innovation comes from, this idea of complex adaptive systems and resilient systems. Resilient systems can be quite robust, but they can also have negative outcomes. So we can think of, systems that we have in place that, we don't wake up every morning, I don't think, most of us, and say, oh, what a beautiful day. It's another wonderful day to destroy the environment. Yet we participate in all kinds of activities, each and every one of us, that actually destroys the environment. And so how does that happen? And I started to become interested in that. So I applied to Getting to Maybe. I was very fortunate that I was selected. So that was a program that was run at the Banff Centre, and we were there for 1 month exploring systems change. And the same year, I was selected for the International Women's Forum, which is a global leadership program sponsored by Harvard Business School and INSEAD. And the same year, I got recruited into the PhD program at Waterloo in social and ecological sustainability. So I was working full-time, I was doing Getting to Maybe, and I was doing the fellowship. But I was taking it all in because I saw in systems thinking and complexity theory an opportunity to address really deep-rooted problems in a way that was different than the siloed approach and the funded approach that most nonprofit organizations, governmental, meaning tribal governments, First Nations, have to approach problems, which are with Band-Aid solutions. You have a year of funding, these are your KPIs, your key performance indicators, you're going to try to change the world in a year. And social innovation takes a long time. So when we think about social innovation, a good example is public libraries, right? Andrew Carnegie. So the printing press revolutionized knowledge in the Western world. It gave more people access to knowledge through the writing of books. But only really wealthy people could afford books. And so Carnegie saw his boss, who owned a factory, loaning out reading materials to people and saying, just promise to bring them back. And he thought, well, why don't we scale that? And so he kind of franchised that model with the idea that poor people and people who couldn't afford, books at the time should have access to that knowledge. And kind of democratize that knowledge, and then he ended up funding, I think, something like 2,500. He was a philanthropist, ended up funding about 2,500 libraries across Canada and the United States. And so I thought about, well, how do I create the library system? I mean, how do we get access to this kind of knowledge, and what can we do about it? And through the Waterloo Institute for Social Innovation, where I'm a fellow, we started thinking also about the intersection of Anishinaabe, Gikindasuan, and Indamawin. So our knowledge systems and our wisdom, together with complexity theory and systems thinking, because we're natural systems thinkers, Indigenous people, Anishinaabe, we think about the interconnected web of life. Even the PhD program I'm in, social and ecological sustainability, that's a decoupling of the social and cultural from nature, right? And so when we think about Anishinaabe, our language system, which encodes our way of thinking and our ancestral way of thinking, we don't have a way to really express that decoupling. It's all one, Yadakimanan. It means everything in creation, the sun, the moon, the stars, and your sacred place within creation. I actually was texting an elder back home in Manitou Rapids when I was surrounded by environmentalists that kept talking about the environment and nature and land. And we had a key land, but what was the word? And so that's what he texted me back, Yadakimanan. He said, that means everything. And there is no separation of nature and environment. And so I started to think about how Anishinaabe, Gikendasuan would potentially contribute to this systems thinking and this complexity theory. And that work has brought me to supporting organizations, institutions, and processes that are engaged in what, and for those of you who have been to Trent, you're probably familiar with Albert and Merdina Marshall, the Mi'kmaq elders who talked about two-eyed seeing. And two-eyed seeing is this principle, the gift of multiple perspectives, that with one eye you're seeing with what you're taught perhaps in the Western world, and with the other eye, you're honoring the strength of maybe your ancestral knowledge. So your Gidakimanan, you would, be able to study science, and you would be able to also bring your knowledge system to the study of what you're thinking about. And that work's what brought me to Nassau. I support the Nassau Earth Sciences Capacity Building Program. We use remote sensing and GIS technology to real-time monitor what's changing on the land. Dr. Carletta Chief, who's a Navajo hydrologist, for example, measures the drought because climate change is adversely affecting Indigenous peoples and food security and our capacity to be able to go out on the land, to hunt, to fish, to trap. I mean, there's other things as well, environmental degradation, loss of biodiversity, demands for land production, land dispossession, the enclosure movement, and the whole history of colonization in Canada has contributed to that food insecurity. So I also come to food at a personal level. So in the same year that I was taking on and experiencing all these new opportunities, these fellowships and these programs, I was also diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And it was kind of a shock. It was a shock in the sense that, oh, wow, yeah, that's what everybody gets back home, and now I have it. And what does that mean? And for the first year, I think I tackled it, and I lost some weight, and I was deciding to really do something about it. But then I just went back to business as usual. And then a little while later, my mom had been diagnosed as well. My husband wasn't, but we were in the house and we were thinking about, I think we need to do something important here. And so we became vegetarians except for wild meat. And following a plant-based diet was what we felt was a good way to start. And then we started to follow a low GL load. And we started researching, and I'm a voracious reader, and we started to research, what's glycemic load, what does that mean? And at the same time, because of the social innovation work, I started to get involved with different projects that were tackling food. And so I was invited to be an advisor to the Food Systems Lab. And the Food Systems Lab, it's a research and innovation hub now located at Simon Fraser University. We work on solutions for equitable collaboration to reduce food waste and support a sustainable food system that enhances ecosystems, conserves natural resources, and mitigates climate change. But that particular food lab, it was a social change lab, was in Toronto, and it was looking at food waste in the GTA. And I started to think about food provenance. I started to think about food systems. I saw a map we do systems mapping quite a bit in systems thinking. And I saw a food map that showed a typical food plate and where all the food came from. And it involved something like 57 countries when you start thinking about your spices and where they went from ship to ship, shore to shore. And I started thinking about seasonal foods. And I started to realize that I was quite disconnected from my food sources, thinking about food. And yet my ancestors were very connected to food. Our lunar system is based on foods, you know, the blueberry month and the maple sugar month. And we had ways of preserving food and accessing food that was sustainable. So in 2016, I worked with the Food Systems Lab, helping them think about Anishinaabe Gikindasawin in terms of food waste and how in our ceremonies we don't waste food and what that meant. And then I met a gentleman named Dave Cranenberg, who runs a game farm near here. And he was working for the Center for Social Innovation. But he invited me to participate in something called Nourish, the Future of Food and Healthcare. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that right now, because I think Nourish is a different way of looking at gender and food insecurity in the sense of the prevalence of Indigenous women that are in healthcare facilities and the malnourishment that happens within healthcare facilities. And so Nourish is a project that's funded by the McConnell Foundation, and I'll tell you a little bit about the model. The idea is that Nourish sought 25 innovators from organizations across the country that were working on food and healthcare settings. And they were working on food specifically because of the narrative around food. It's kind of down there with parking in terms of hospital administrators and what they're thinking about. They're thinking about, you know, MRIs and then machines and funding, and they're thinking about all kinds of things. And the joke about food, right, and food being yucky in hospitals. And there are pockets of what we call, there's 3 levels of innovation in system thinking that's often talked about. Niche is like these pockets of innovation, kind of like a micro level. Then there's the regime level, which is more regional. And then there's the landscape level, where you're talking about macro level, large scale, global paradigm shift, systemic change. And so at the niche level, there are innovations happening, but they're in pockets across the country. So there's a great hospital here that runs, you know, a garden program. There are hospitals in Quebec that do room service menus, if you can imagine. You eat what you want when you're hungry. It sounds revolutionary because it doesn't happen in hospitals, right? We're used to the trays coming in and here you go. And so Nourish started to think about how do we scale some of those innovations. And a huge part of it is also changing the narrative. It's changing the narrative around food as medicine, mishkiki. And in Anishinaabe, we understand that because so many of our traditional health teachings are about food. You know, when women were pregnant, they were told to drink fish broth, and it made the babies really healthy and the breast milk really healthy. Labrador tea. There's so many things that we had that, because of the medicalization of food and healthcare to a biomedical model of the prevention and absence of disease, as opposed to our model of wellness, which is the balance between spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional, we had those as prescriptions. They call them social prescriptions now, and if you've heard about, you know, doctors telling you to go to an art gallery, but also prescribing that you eat healthy. So I'm just going to quickly tell you about the theory of change for Nourish. And it's really about changing the narrative through research, strategic communications, and partnerships. And what it's trying to do is build demand for all of us as consumers of healthcare to actually demand good, sustainable, local, healthy, nutritious foods in healthcare settings. Because when my auntie saw her tray of food come in, it's chicken kiever, I can't remember, chicken teriyaki or something that came in, I can pretty much, you know, guarantee you that she was not thinking, where did this come from? What's the nutritional content? Is this traditional foods? She was just looking at it as a tray of food, right? And so building demand, influencing policy, and growing supply. And I'm going to talk for a little bit about the program that I work in, but there are 10 insights that I'll share from Nourish, just to give you an idea of what people are working on. So the 10 insights are that the Nourish cohort, so there's 25 people in the Nourish program, are talking about food. So they're feeding the conversation of food and healthcare, that they're willing and ready, that there's a collective imagination across Canada around food and healthcare settings. There's critical connections, so relationship building is really key in this kind of work. Dancing with systems, and this is about seeing yourself in system. And so often when we do advocacy work, there's a tendency to want to point to the bad guy, the one that's at fault for something. But there are lots of structural processes, lots of things at play, lots of dynamics. There are systems and what we call system archetypes or system traps, where the solution that we first came up with, we think is the answer to the problem, but that solution has become the problem. And then we start playing with numbers. We just need more of this. We need an increased budget. And Dana Meadows calls that the least effective change work in systems thinking. That's like organizing deck chairs on the Titanic. We're not going to solve homelessness by increasing the number of shelters. We have to look further into the deep-rooted causes, which can be really complex. Because of course, when you get down to it, there's a whole bunch of isms that cause some of these problems, like capitalism, sexism, and racism. And so the team I'm working with is the Traditional Foods Program team. And that's what I wanted to share a little bit of that work with you. So the Nourish cohort over the past 2 years has participated in retreats. We had retreats where we did field visits. It was the first time I ever had an opportunity to visit an organic farm outside of Montreal. And then we were in Brew Creek near Whistler in Squamish territory last year. Had an opportunity to visit local beekeepers and to go to a biodynamic farm. It's the first time I ever heard about a CSA. The farmers kept talking about that. I said, what does that stand for? Community Supported Agriculture. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means you can buy my food and it's local and it's organic and it's healthy and you're supporting me and my family and you're getting access to healthy foods. And I thought, this is amazing. I had no idea there was an alternative to the grocery store. And so there's 5 emergent pathways to change that the Nourish team has come up with collectively about food and healthcare. There's patient and resident food experience, local and sustainable procurement, so talking about the supply chain, right? Where do hospitals get their food? Sustainable menus, traditional foods, and preventative health. And I'm just going to wrap up telling you a little bit about the Traditional Foods Program team because that's who I get to work with. So Traditional Foods is about what we call in the North country foods, local indigenous foods, Monoman, wild rice, a staple for Anishinaabe, blueberries, maple syrup. Not necessarily the contemporary food that we think of, Indian tacos and bannock and things like that. We're actually talking about the food of our ancestors, which was quite healthy. And it's about bringing those foods to healthcare. And I'll never forget, we started with a circle of Indigenous advisors. And there was an Inuit woman there who worked at a long-term care facility in Ottawa. And she said there was an Inuit elder who was quite ill, thousands of miles away from home, and she had to be there for her care. Often they're there for dialysis, or they're there for palliative care away from home. And she wanted her foods, right, her traditional foods, but traditional Inuit foods involve seal meat, wild game, and sometimes raw or frozen seal meat. And the worker managed to get her some seal meat, and she was 92 years old, and she said she just cried because she saw the food of her people, of her childhood, of her land. And so I think seeing food insecurity in hospital settings through the lens of the right to traditional and cultural foods, the right to healthy and sustainable foods, I think as consumers, we all have that right, but that's a big system to take on the healthcare system, to take on their procurement, to take on their supply chain. And that's what these participants are doing in Nourish, and the investment in Nourish is in those people as change makers. And so I'm a big supporter of investing in change makers, people who are sort of thinking about systems, interested in thinking about systems. The change in the narrative for that particular aspect of the program is food as medicine. So there's a natural alignment between Indigenous ways and systems thinking, and it centers the spirituality of food. And I'll wrap up by saying some of the work that I do with a number of different organizations and foundations, and I speak at universities to scientists. I work with the Engineering Change Lab, for example, looking at engineering and the contribution of engineers to society. All of this work comes down to one thing, it is spirituality. And encoded in our language is the connection, and it's a spiritual connection to the land. And I bring people back home, to the lodge back home sometimes, or we create a sacred space in an environment like this. So we were in Vancouver recently, and the elders brought in cedar boughs, and everybody had to walk across a cedar bough to come into the room. There's a beautiful teaching of creating a sacred and safe space in a hotel in North Vancouver, in Squamish territory. And so food has become a pathway to reconciliation in the work of Nourish, and I think thinking about the role that food plays as medicine is really an important part of that work, and it's an important pathway. And it's also a common denominator. It's a common reference point for people. And so Nourish is having a capstone event, a symposium in Toronto at Evergreen Brickworks on May 15th and 16th. And we have some great guest speakers that we can't announce yet, but we are doing medicine walks, and we're taking people on the land, and I think they're doing it through Eventbrite or something, so it's going to be open to the public, but it'll be an opportunity to learn more about Nourish. And the Traditional Foods Program team just produced a documentary with Kathy Loon about Meacham. And that's the last thing I'll share with you, is Meacham is a traditional foods program at Menayawin, which is the hospital in Sioux Lookout, serves 28 First Nation communities in the north. They had to build a separate kitchen. That's how they got around the policy around wild game. And interestingly enough, if you can imagine the paradox that our food is considered unsafe, the food that sustained us for generations and millennia, wild game, raw seal meat, fish, all of this donated food is heavily monitored, and so they had to build a separate kitchen so that they could prepare. And so one day a week they serve traditional foods to the patients in Menayawin, which is beautiful. They serve wild game, fish, and a lot of it's caught, is actually, there's a picture. Sorry I didn't bring slides, because it's, well, that's Kathy, and that's from the documentary. That's her pulling in her nets. She's from a First Nation near Sioux Lookout, and she actually goes out and finds a lot of the wild game. But what's interesting from the systems perspective is the procurement of wild game, when less and less young people are hunting, trapping and fishing, and getting access to land. It's part of the issue of getting more traditional foods into healthcare settings. And so those land-based programs that First Nations are doing are really critical, and you can see it from a systems perspective that it's going to influence a project like this. So Miigwech, thank you for listening. I'm at my time, and thank you for the invitation to come join you tonight. It was really appreciated. It's an honor. Miigwech.
I'll ask our panelists all to come to the table, and now we're going to open up. We'll get ready to open up for some questions. But I just want to thank you, Melanie, for sharing your stories of your teachings and stories of the your Nourish project, different from our Peterborough Nourish project, but about that innovation and that systems thinking, because I think that is one of the things along with food security, that brings us all here tonight. So thank you for that. I'm going to hand a microphone to our speakers, and we're going to open up the floor to questions, and I will do some running around. So I'll open the floor, and you just put your hand up, and I'll come over with a microphone. So I'll get you to hand those around. Any questions to start? You don't have to be shy. I'll come over.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. All three were just incredible. I'm a part-time teaching assistant at Trent University, and this morning my students were debating SDG 2, the Sustainable Development Goal 2, which is zero hunger. And these issues came up because they had to talk about how, whether or not they were debating whether or not Canada will achieve SDG 2 by 2030. And so these sort of issues around food security / insecurity came up because they had to present statistics, you know, one team against the other. And in fact, everyone, debate aside, did not believe that Canada was going to achieve this goal, myself included. And I did tell them about this talk because I thought it was so relevant. But one of the things that, you know, we're asked in class, because when we provide the definition for food security, the definition includes culturally appropriate food. And I think, you know, maybe they're also young, but they always question, why is that important? If you're starving, if you're really hungry, why does it matter what kind of food is available to you? And so I really appreciated, particularly, you know, at the end, the connection to, you know, the culturally appropriate food when it comes to traditions and when it comes to what is being valued. The lady that you referred to, who when she saw the seal meat, you know, brought tears to her eyes. And I was wondering if that, you know, you see that, how you see that play out with other groups in the communities. For example, Marianne, when you talk to people in the Peterborough community, what was that like for them? You know, what kind of, how does it matter to them? What kind of food they value and what kind of food is available to them? And how do we see that sort of become resolved within that larger question around food insecurity?
Thank you. Thank you. All right, it's a big question. I think some of my participants did talk about culture, and they talked about how they weren't able to find exactly what they needed in Peterborough. One of the struggles I had with this particular study is that I wasn't able to get a really broad range of cultural backgrounds in my sample, in the women that I interviewed. But having said that, there were a few who talked about the importance of cultural foods that they just were having difficulty finding here in Peterborough, and its connection to the past, its connection to other people in their lives, its connection to family, and its connection to health as well. And so I think when we look at the inclusion of cultural appropriate food in SDG 2 or in our definition of food security, that it has to do also with health, it has to do with dignity, and it has to do with connection, which are all really important components for moving things forward. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Anybody else?
Does anybody?
Yeah. No, I'll just add that in terms of Anishinaabe, Gik, and Nassauin, I forgot I was going to share this book for anybody that's interested. Our Knowledge is Not Primitive, Decolonizing Botanical Anishinaabe Teachings by Wendy Makones-Ginias. She spent time in Minnesota and Wisconsin talking to elders about food, and I got a lot of my food and plant knowledge from this book because she actually speaks to the colonization of Anishinaabe understandings of the science of food. And so we understood that blueberries, and we called it the blueberry moon, and we had stories about if you had enough blueberries you'd be okay till the spring. But it's also because of the micronutrients, and people knew how to mix foods, how to plant foods, and she speaks about how originally botanists, anthropologists, researchers misinterpreted a lot of that knowledge and then presented it back to the world in a very colonized way. In fact, relating it to the scientific definitions of some food, which misunderstood or left out or discarded the teachings that Indigenous peoples had about those foods that scientists didn't know about. And so this is a great book that talks about Monoman wild rice and the importance of it, not only from a cultural perspective of its comfort food in some ways, to see that seal meat. She couldn't eat it, actually. She was too sick to eat that elder. But just seeing that seal meat after months of being in a care facility without seeing her foods in her homeland, I mean, she's Inuit, was, I think, part of her holistic mental health and well-being while she was, in that healthcare setting. So this is a really good book that speaks to that. And of course, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Walker speaks to that. And I like them because they're both trained in understanding those sciences of botany and plant knowledge, and speaks to the challenges as well politically of wild rice. I was in Bad River, Wisconsin, where the wild rice paddies are being destroyed because of the cottagers in the area and the lack of access for the traditional peoples to get their food, and yet wild rice is a major sustenance of health and nutrition and really good for people with diabetes and other things. And so that access to their own foods in their own homelands is a human rights issue, I think, too. So there's a lot, of complexity around that for sure. So thank you for your question, Miigwech.
Hi, excuse me. I'm a Trent University student, second year of political studies, but my prior profession, I worked with the disabled, both mentally, physically, as well as psychiatrically, or with mental health issues. And I worked for the Ontario government for 16 years, and that's during my care time period and before. But I was in the field for 30 years. Now, I remember in college we learned this term, which has changed now, pardon the expression, environmental retardation. And that's my biggest concern because of food poverty that's going on. Has there been any studies as to how children, because it's developmental age, is the greatest time period is 0 to 5 years, how it has affected the mental capacity? And secondly, because of the food poverty as it continues on, and the way that I see it over the time that we have had of neoliberalism, that things are becoming more decrepit. I don't want to sound negative, because there's always light at the end of the tunnel kind of deal. But has there been studies conducted following a child from, say, the age of 3 at kindergarten until the age of 16?
So, there have been, yes, yes, there have been studies like that. Your first question, yes, sadly, we do have data in Ontario, in fact, whereby we can see that children in situations where they're being exposed, or we've got reports of maternal food insecurity, we can see that, by the age of 5, they are more likely to have been treated for behavioral or developmental delays. I mean, what does that look like when that child is 15 or 25? I don't know. But certainly, we've done work in Ontario, which we haven't published yet, and there's been work done in Quebec, and it absolutely shows that children in those circumstances are disadvantaged. How much of that is nutritional is a wide open question, because there must be so many ways in which that environment is difficult for a child, not just from a nutrient perspective, but also in terms of the stress and the other sorts of deprivation that would be happening in the environment. So I think it's complicated in terms of what's driving it, but absolutely. Several years back in the 90s, there was a study started, a federal study that was the National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth. And it began in 1994, and it recruited families with young children and followed them over time for like 20 or more years. And back then we didn't have a lot of sophistication in terms of how to measure food insecurity. So the question that was asked is, has your child ever gone hungry because you didn't have enough food or money for food? And if yes, how often does that happen and what did you do about it? Well, not very many mothers said yes to that question, as you can imagine. But those who did, when you look at their children, when they became teenagers and then in early adulthood, absolutely we can see disadvantage. And not a lot of things were measured because, this started back in 1994 and there wasn't a lot of foresight, I think. And eventually, and I can't even remember if this was a liberal or conservative decision, but the decision was made at some point a few years ago to cut the tracking of these kids, so it doesn't, the lights have been turned off there. But there's a body of papers that have come out of those analyses, and by the time those kids were teenagers, they were more likely to have been diagnosed with asthma, depression, and a whole range of chronic conditions. Another analysis showed that they were more likely to have suicidal thoughts. They were less likely, as you can imagine, to do well in school. If they were girls, they were more likely to have become pregnant and given birth at an earlier age. So, they're just indicators, but I think it's exactly as you're describing. Your experience of working, in a helping capacity. What you saw is exactly what we see when we look at larger numbers. That the disadvantage that we are exposing children to by creating this situation where simply, being a child is enough to increase the probability of being exposed to these conditions, and then the idea that for some children that exposure is chronic. There's no question. It leaves an indelible mark on those children's health and well-being. No question.
Thank you, all three of you, for your talks. Those were excellent. I have a question about local food. I do work in local food advocacy and farmers markets, and I feel like there's a disconnect between the conversations happening around local food and conversations happening around food security and food insecurity. And I wonder if any of you could speak to how we can think about the fight for better access to local food and food insecurity, and how those two sort of efforts can come together. The question about culturally appropriate food also comes to mind, because oftentimes local foods aren't necessarily culturally appropriate to everyone in that community. And so how can we think about these things all together to create a food system that touches on each of these issues?
Thanks for your question. I think there's a few things that perhaps can be done. One of them is broader education about producers and about farmers and about how they're being compensated and what their lives look like. And I think that oftentimes they're invisible from the picture when we talk about food insecurity. But we need to be looking at the fact that farmers' incomes are often quite compromised, and that farmers are among people living in food insecurity. So I think that's part of it. Partly it's about education and about raising awareness. I think there are some efforts that have been taken to try and bring those two aspects together as well. Things like here in Peterborough, there are the Nourish dollars that are used at the farmers market, and this allows people who are living on low incomes or participants in food programs to take those dollars and to use them to have access to fresh and local food and to support their local farmers at the same time. I know that Just Food, the Just Food Box program, tries to use local food, to purchase local food as much as possible and make it available to people living on low incomes. But I think there are probably lots of other ways of being innovative. I know at the Peterborough Food Action Network, we're now looking at exploring outside of the community a bit more as to what other communities are doing about some of these kinds of problems. or issues, and trying to see what might be worthwhile looking at in this community as well. Okay.
Melanie or Bob?
My thinking is a bit different. I don't think food insecurity is a food problem. And I don't think it is. And I think that it's a marker of serious material deprivation. We find people who are struggling through the lens of food because it's such a primal thing. But as soon as we scratch the surface, they're not just compromising their food. This isn't about what they've got on their plate. They're compromising their housing circumstances, their social life, their health care. I mean, you know, somebody who is struggling to put food on the table isn't flossing their teeth. They're not getting their kids immunized. Their shoes are worn out, and their kids, you know, don't have boots that fit them or proper winter wear. Like it, you know, we just, all you've got to do is peel off the layer. So while I get that we start by talking about food insecurity, and you know, you made a lot of really good points about the ways in which the drive towards local food can be made more inclusive, and you know, I mean, there's a lot. You know, this isn't to say that local food is unimportant, but for me, there is a very good reason why these things are separated and why they should be separated. Because if we continue to reduce the problem of food insecurity as it's been measured, and it's not, I mean, the reason I showed you the measurement is because I wanted you to see what a stripped down thing we're capturing there, right? People not having enough to eat because they don't have money for food, right? I mean, we're so far from them having healthy food or culturally appropriate food. We're just talking about them not even having anything to eat. So, I mean, it's a very particular problem. And not to say that, you know, it shouldn't be a problem that we think is this big, all-encompassing thing for all ideals that we have about food being local and culturally appropriate and dignified. Like, we're so far from that with what we're measuring on these surveys, it isn't even funny. But I think it's important to recognize that, because until we name it, or people like me who work in this field, you know, are so determined to name it, we're not going to fix it. And so that's why it's important for me to just say, you know, damn it, let's pull these things apart, because this thing is terrible, and it's not going to get better if we keep looking to mush it in and to kind of, you know, dampen it down. That we start by asking questions about food, because by the time somebody doesn't have enough to eat, we've got somebody who's in really bad shape. And that's why those healthcare numbers look like they do. It's not because of some lack of vitamin A. And so I feel like it's, you know, it's a tough one. I get that it's, you know, it's a struggle especially at communities, as you try to figure out where to put your resources, where to put your energy, and what you can do about a problem that seems in some ways to be rooted in things that are quite remote from the local level. But for me, you know, I'm old. I'm ready to fight and pull these things apart and say, like, let's talk about what it is, because until we do that, we're missing some horrible, horrible stuff that's going on in our communities every day.
Yeah.
Yes. Melanie, did you have anything to add on that?
No, that was
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Okay, just a sec.
Oh, okay. This question's for Melanie. Back to Sioux Lookout. How big is Sioux Lookout, population-wise?
Population-wise, I don't know offhand, but it's quite small. Like I'm thinking maybe 6,000, but it's an entry point to the north, so the hospital actually serves like a much larger population.
Right. So I'm interested to know how come Sioux Lookout has this very progressive attitude in their hospital. I mean, we have a lot of First Nations people in our area. I don't think anything like that happens in our hospital. How did they get to that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I can actually answer that because I was the Director of Health Policy and Planning at Anishinaabe Nation. So Sioux Lookout actually had two hospitals back in the day. There was the Indian hospital and the White hospital. And the Indian hospital was funded federally, and then the white hospital, or the mainstream hospital, was part of the regular provincial healthcare system. And so there's a jurisdictional issue that led to that. But then there was a protest by some folks who went on a hunger strike, some chiefs and some elders, about the care that was happening at the federal hospital, which was called the Indian hospital back then. And so there was a 4-party agreement between the provincial government, the federal government, the town of Sioux Lookout, and the First Nations leadership. And that 4-party agreement after the hunger strike led to the creation of Menoyawin, which would be a more culturally appropriated, amalgamated hospital. And so they broke ground several years ago, built a new hospital, a new hostel for the patients coming in from the north. And it's actually has been built with culturally appropriate design and architecture. So there are smudging areas, and there's quite a few people on staff. There are translators, and Meacham is one of the traditional programs that they have there, specifically looking at food. And so they built the separate kitchen from the beginning, and I think that's a real challenge across the country. When I was saying niche innovations, they're almost kind of frustrating because there's amazing things that are happening in one town, one neighborhood, one organization, and how do we scale those? Should we scale those? The answer from Nourish and the Traditional Foods Program team, there's a similar program, not quite the same. I think that's one of the only ones in Canada, but there is some excellent work done in Haida Gwaii and in Yellowknife in the in a hospital there. And so Sioux Lookout was pretty unique, actually, in its history and how that hospital came to be. And there's also a unique partnership with the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, NOSM. That program, which is the new Northern Medical School, ensures that doctors have culturally appropriate coursework and that they actually get assigned to work in northern communities. And I've heard from Menoyawin, they'll actually know a doctor that came from that school versus any other school by the levels of culturally safe and appropriate care that they can provide, because they know about the holistic approach to health, which includes trauma-informed care, differences in language, and also the recognition that food can be a trigger, because food was used as a weapon in residential schools. Hunger, malnourishment was used. And so for anybody from that generation that was in residential schools, being cold, being hungry, can be a trigger to when they were 5 or 6 years old at an institution eating mush. They used to, and they'll speak specifically about some of those foods. And so, Meacham, the video that's coming out, I think it's about 15 minutes long. It actually shows Kathy Loon out on the land hauling in nets of fish and checking her trap line this winter. It was -30, I guess, when they were filming. And about how she's able to get that food. And she also had to negotiate a relationship with the Ministry of Natural Resources that was kind of getting in the way of hunters being able to donate their food, and they broke through some of that. So it's quite a lot of work that had been done to get to that point, for sure. But it would be nice to get that message out there and tell more people about it. Miigwech.
This is more as a comment than a question. We need to continue to be active and proactive in lobbying the government, doing whatever it takes to help us who are in low income. And I'm including myself because I'm living on low income and living on my own, having to deal with depression because of the isolation. But we need to continue to be proactive and keep the government in check of what they need to do to help us. And one more thing is, the food banks here in Peterborough, a lot of them are not wheelchair accessible or accessible for people who are having mobility issues. So this is what I'm just
Any comments?
I think you're absolutely right. We need to keep the pressure on the government, and we can't let up. And food banks. I think that there are lots of different ways that you can look at them, and I think that there are lots of different concerns that people have, and certainly that is one. Making them more accessible is an important one for sure. Thank you so much for your comments, Katie.
So I guess I'm just building on what Katie just said, and I'm wondering what should we do with the government right now? If we've got a federal election coming up, what is, in terms of income issues, what should be our fight here in Peterborough?
Grab the microphone.
It's a tough one. I mean, especially right now, as this, it's so hard to imagine what politics will look like by the time we get to October. But the federal government under Jean-Luc Duclos released a poverty reduction strategy in August of this past year. And from the perspective of poverty and food insecurity, I think that was a landmark document. And I mean, for one thing, it named food insecurity as part of its vision and its direction. It named it as a problem under a rubric of dignity, and named it as something that needed to be tracked as part of their dashboard and with a bunch of measures to be evaluated against it. Things like the Canada Child Benefit that should be absolutely a lever to reduce food insecurity amongst families with children in Canada. Very, very strong gender focus. So were this government to carry on, I think it would be really, really important for us to be supporting Duclos' direction that is outlined in that document. It truly is the first time federally we have seen a document that even was aspiring to make significant inroads around poverty. So I think that that's a very significant direction to support. Beyond that, I mean, I was wondering if where you were going was to things like basic income, and is this a time to talk about basic income? And maybe it is. I mean, one of the things that is very important about basic income is that it's a positive message. Everything else that people like me say about food insecurity or poverty is negative. It's a deficit. Whereas basic income has there's a way in which it can be spun that seems to, it's drawing people together in a way that we haven't seen before. In some ways, it's a new idea. There are people who would argue that it's an untenable idea because of the costs associated with it, but the principles are quite lovely. So I don't know. I mean, I think there are a couple of different possible directions on the landscape. One being simply the realization of the vision that's articulated in the federal strategy, which would absolutely address the kinds of issues that I study. Or a different kind of a vision, a more radical restructuring of social welfare to incorporate basic income.
Thanks. What I would add to that is that we've been promised a national food policy, and we're still waiting for it. And so if it doesn't come through, I think it's important that we keep pushing for that as well. And that has, or should have, one component at least that looks at food access and food security. So I think that's another way to pressure the government.
Great. Well, the time on the clock on the wall says it's past 8:30. So I just want to thank, first of all, our three panelists, Valerie, Marianne, and Melanie, for coming to be with us today. And for sharing some really important, thought-provoking work, and I think inspiring us about what we have to do next. So thank you, and thank you to all of you for coming tonight to join us, and especially to, as well, the Nourish team for all their work for pulling this together for us to be able to learn and be together. I also have to say, if you are a social media person, tomorrow is Fact Friday of the Nourish project. So I encourage you to take a look every Friday at what the Nourish team is sharing to challenge us again about actions that we need to take based on what we know about our community and our country. So thank you and have a great evening.